All right, so Rick kind of preempted or kind of led us into this talk about regulation. Our final talk of the day is going to be just focused on that, on regulation and its effects on the economy. And for that, we're going to have with us my colleague at the University of South Carolina, Bentley Coffey. Bentley is one of the most curious economists I know. He does work and research on a number of issues, but is particularly an expert on uh, regulation and environmental policy. And so we're glad to have him here with us, talking about recent work he's been doing in terms of modeling regulation.
Hi, welcome everyone. Jason, I think I have the ability to share, right?
You should now, yes, sir.
Okay, so I've got a few slides in like a slide deck, um, and then I will switch over to this model that I've been building for the open source community to take advantage of. Um, I'll just share the whole screen. I don't have anything to hide. All right, here. Right. So um, we've put together this model that have a working title here of REM. So Regulatory Reform Economic Model. It's a collaboration between me, Patrick McLaughlin, who used to be at the Mercatus Center at George Mason, but is now at Hoover Institution at Stanford, and Pietro Pareto from Duke University. So Pietro was one of my mentors when I did my PhD there. I was one of Patrick's mentors when he did his PhD at Clemson. So it's a family tree affair. Um, so there's our picture and sort of the roles of how we fit together as a research team. Pietro is an extraordinary theoretical modeler, but likes to boast that he doesn't work with numbers in a computer. Patrick, on the other hand, has been working really hard ever since he was in grad school. You know, we had these ideas about how we could quantify uh, regulatory constraints. And man, he has taken that and run with it and created some really cool products that you can check out on QuantGov. But the one there that we lean on most here is called RegData. So I'll talk a little bit more about it. But Patrick also has lots of institutional knowledge and knowledge of the literature on the economics of regulation. And so I'm sort of the jack of all trades that has to understand all of their pieces and make sure that I fit them all together to build stuff. Um, so our seminal article was in the Review of Economic Dynamics in 2020. Um, and I guess this is the money shot that they call it, or the big take home. So we fit this model to the economy, and then we ran this counterfactual projection of, okay, what if there was a freeze in the stock of regulations in 1981? You know, what would that have looked like if you forecasted it on for 30 years? And so we had something like a pretty sizable difference in GDP. Um, so that got some attention. And since then, we've sort of built that model and developed it in different directions. So we have in one direction working on an environmental adaptation and another a transportation. Um, so yeah, cost of moving around goods. Um, and yeah, it continues to roll on, although I probably should put more effort into getting working papers into journals and less coming up with yet additional cool ideas. Um, so our general motivation is that, you know, economists don't seem to understand the full effects of regulations the same way we do taxes. right? We've studied taxes for so long that we're so good at quantifying the effects that we can create a little diagram and describe the triangles like the so if you're not familiar with this, there's the little deadweight loss piece that's the orange triangle in there that we can describe as a result of the tax by decreasing the total quantity of stuff that's being produced. Um, and yeah, we're really good at that as economists, but it ends up that regulations are written in sort of a bureaucratic legalese. And so it's not inherently quantitative data that's easy to work with. It's mostly text data. So what are you going to do? Well, you can think about it conceptually as regulatory restrictions are like binding constraints on firms. They tend to make their cost curves. They shift them up and make them more convex. There are some special cases where a regulation can look like and have the exact same effect as a tax, but that's not necessarily the correct description of all of them. And then if you think about them as a binding constraint, we can think of the firm's problem as a constrained optimization. So down here in the bottom left, I've got a picture where you've got two non-negativity constraints and a production technology capacity constraint. And then if the bottom middle, if I just throw a whole bunch of regulatory constraints on there as well, constraining how I can combine two different inputs to make outputs, you can see it starts to form a really awkward shape that you would have to optimize to search in. And of course, we know that most firms' production process don't actually have just two inputs, but rather, many inputs and often multiple outputs. So if you think about something like oil refining, so navigating this space gets really, really hard. And you hear firms complain about, that we've got this maze of these restrictions. And just sort of as a joke, I then took from two inputs to three inputs and put a bunch of regulatory constraints that made a pretty little soccer ball. But anyway, we have this idea that there's the costs of these constraints is convex in the number of these regulatory restrictions. So as you increase them, they become increasingly costly. Um, and the data uh, suggests that we've been increasing regulations quite a lot, right? So if you the basic time path in this picture shows the count of words that denote constraints in the federal code of regulations. So you have words like shall that bureaucrats use to mean you have to do something that you really don't see in our regular language, but it's very clear what it means there. And so we've got that scale on the left. The scale on the right is sort of the count of number of pages in the Code of Federal Regulations as sort of a proxy of how stringent the regulatory environment is. So down there in the bottom right, there's Patrick at 6'2", and the height of the Code of Federal Regulations would be roughly 24 feet tall. So if you had a regular human reading speed, you couldn't read the entirety of the Code of Federal Regulations in a year. And this is why it really pushes you towards machine learning, because you want to be able to consistently qualify this stuff. So that's what Patrick did in the creation of RegData, is essentially we go around counting up all these shalls, and then we look for the vocabulary surrounding the shalls to figure out the probability that this restriction applies to a given industry. And so the documents that we seed to that are a bunch of regulatory impact analyses, that sort of stuff, where a human economist has said, okay, this is going to affect industries in these NAICS codes. And we look at those, at the language used in those to sort of identify industry specific terms so that it sort of clues you in as to who's likely to be affected by this. And so unlike just counting a number of pages, we've now got something like count of regulatory restrictions as they apply to various individual industries. And that allows us to do an industry by industry analysis. Right? So here's something like the stock of the regulatory restrictions for the 35 industries that we use in this reg REM model. So they aren't exactly the standard NAICS descriptions because, you know, some of those are rather long. So they're my short form version of those, but you can see there's 35 different industries. There's nothing systematic in the selection of the industries that we've done that should bias results. It's just basically where do you have the best data? And that's in terms of the measure of the confidence of the machine learning to make sure that we think we've got a reasonably good signal on what regulatory accumulation looks like. So we build a theoretical model, right? That's what we did, and it's a big macro model. It's got lots of moving pieces. But the workhorse of the model is in the bottom right, and they're intermediate goods producing firms. So you can think of them as being manufacturers that make parts that fit into creating the whole good that's out there. And they have differentiated intermediate goods, and they invest in productivity enhancing knowledge. There's some spillovers in that knowledge that's driving this endogenous growth. And there's a free entry and exit from the market. When you go through and solve this, you end up getting a sort of a logistic growth function that describes the time path for firms per capita and exponential growth in knowledge. These are closed form solutions, which if you've worked with math means you don't have to do quite as much work computationally to get to an answer. So there are a bunch of equations that describe, you know, the primitives of what's going on in the model. I'll just describe for you this top one here. And xi, it's a production function for the intermediate good of establishment J in industry I. And Z is sort of its stock of knowledge that it has. And so what's driving growth is these firms do R&D to grow their knowledge, and it allows them to be more productive. That is to make more output out of their inputs. So in the brackets there, you have the amount of labor that they employ. And what's being subtracted from that is the amount of labor that is not productive. That is, it's spent on overhead and indeed spent on regulatory compliance. So that's R, there's the capital R is regulation. And I need to put my phone on silent. All right. So there are more equations and more math, and that's all fun and hunky-dory. And eventually you get to this, you know, the thing I just described where you have this logistic time path for number of firms relative to the population. That's capital N over P. And for the growth in knowledge, that's the capital K. And so you might be wondering, how do regulatory constraints enter the specification? So unlike in the red paper, we've dug under the hood and further specified it. So in effect, these fixed costs to the firms, it's going to have some of its own fixed cost of, you know, accounting or whatnot. But then you have the stuff that depends on the regulations promulgated by the government. So LG here is government labor creating new regulations or maintaining existing regulations that's authorized by legislation L. So you sum over all the L's, all the legislation, and that kind of gives you this measure of, well, how many regulations do we have to comply with? How much do we have to spend just to keep up with being compliant with all of the regulatory demands? And so that bottom equation is basically a regulatory budget that comes from how big of a budget Congress gives to an agency that's authorized by legislation L, and they can use that labor to do two things: to maintain an existing stock of regulations and also to promulgate new stuff. In sort of a simplest version of the model, which is what we've fit to data right now, is we've assumed that the maintenance cost is zero, so that they're basically spending all of their labor on promulgating new regulations. So the way that the shocks propagate through the model is, oh, sorry, there's some errant K floating around up there. Sorry about that. That doesn't belong. Anyway, you get a regulatory shock, and that's going to increase the fixed cost of firms, and that's going to decrease the establishment per capita. So, in effect, if it's costlier to create a new establishment, then you expect less entry, or less net entry. And so that changes both what is the model's steady state value that establishments per capita approaches, but also then the existing level as you transition towards that path. By decreasing the number of establishments per capita, the firm gets a larger market share, right? So it gets more of its returns to its R&D are kept in-house, and that raises its returns to investment. So it actually increases investment in knowledge as a result of there being fewer firms to compete with. So together, that makes an ambiguous effect on GDP, right? So you have more investment in knowledge, but you also have fewer firms that are doing that investment. And the diversity, the heterogeneity in firms has a scale effect on overall GDP. It's the idea that you have a more diversified tool set is a more productive tool set. Right. So, what are we doing time-wise? Okay. So our data sources here that we used are pretty standard stuff. I mentioned that RegData is our source of regulatory constraints. There's some variety of national data that gets pulled, and that's all pulled from where you would expect it to be. Our value added to GDP by industry is from the BEA, the NEPA data. But we need this measure of number of establishments, and that's something that sort of in traditional exogenous growth macro land isn't that important. But the dynamics of additional firms entering and competing or exiting the market is a really important feature of describing the transitional dynamics within a endogenous growth model. And that data we grabbed from the survey of county business patterns. The census conducts that survey, I think for commerce. Census is in commerce, but for others there. But it's kind of a low priority. And so it has a surprising amount of latency on when that's available. So that ends up being the data source that holds us back the most in terms of keeping everything current. It's always going to be the one in which the latest available year is less than, some of these other things that are available more frequently. So to give you some sense of, there's a couple of regressions that are being run for every industry. And this is a goodness of fit figure for the 35 industries for the regression involving the number of firms per capita. So in effect, we're making a prediction about the number of firms per capita in the next period as a function of the number of firms per capita this period and interest rates and the growth rate of regulations. So the growth rate of regulation shows up in that fourth big bracketed term, and it's multiplied by or interacted with the squared number of firms per capita. So we get a relatively decent fit that suggests that we're at least able to forecast the next period's firms per capita from this information. Um, and likewise, there's a similar regression that we'd run on a firm's market share. So it's really value added to GDP in the industry divided by the number of establishments in the industry. Um, and in theory, most of those parameters across the two are the same. In practice, this tends to be a much noisier measure, right? So the dynamics of establishments per capita tends to be relatively smoothly changing over time, right? All those demand shocks that you get from things like business cycles, that shows up here uh, to be, more of like a jumping variable here. So you get shocks to price, um, and yeah, so the fit here is not quite as good, but still, not embarrassingly bad. So we can use both of these to make predictions, right, on on GDP per establishment, real GDP per establishment, and establishments per capita. And of course, if you multiply those two things together, then you get real GDP per capita. Um, right. So so we're building this model so policymakers can experiment with these different regulatory budgeting scenarios. We have a pretty uh, tight plan to get it all done within a month. Where we've got some folks at AFPI who are supporting us and helping us launch this thing on the web. And I have a few things left to do. It seems like there's always things to do, but probably need to add the latest data and extend the forecasting period from 1 year to 10 or 20 or longer. Of course, the what's really important about that is that uncertainty sort of compounds as you go out. So if you're familiar with ever seeing what are called those like spaghetti uh, plots, where they do like a time series of a macroeconomic variable and then they're making predictions sort of out into the future, those error bands expand. So that'll be sort of, I think, the last thing we end up tackling on this. But if I can um, go ahead and switch up. So the code associated with the model here is all in R. Um, there are essentially two scripts. Uh, all the source code, of course, is available here that take those standard data sources and one, they estimate the parameters of that model that I was just showing you, those betas. And then also they sort of prepare the data. So this is, data processing, cutting and reshaping and that sort of stuff that goes on. So for the actual um, application itself, it just loads from those two scripts, our data files. Um, and then let's see, so I've got a big function here that uh, does the counterfactual prediction. And then the rest of this is all done with Shiny. And if you're not familiar with Shiny, it's a cool tool that's available for taking models from that you make in R or in Python and generating dynamic web content off of it. Um, so I have, two different scripts. One's a user side, so the client script. So it's going to dictate sort of what the person is seeing and take input from them. And then I have a server-side script that takes that input, handles it, and calls that counterfactual run, and then renders figures that it passes back to the client to graph. So if you haven't worked with Shiny before, I wouldn't say it's necessarily the most user-friendly platform, but it's effectively very few packages you need. Like I'm using Shiny and then an additional one developed by the same folks. And other than that, these two are both Hadley Wickham packages, one on making better graphs and the other for data manipulation. So relatively small amount of packages, but those themselves call other packages. So, we kind of stand on the shoulders of giants sometimes when we produce stuff. So the what this creates uh, looks like this.
Bentley, hit Control Plus or something to zoom in a little bit for us. At least me, I'm on a smaller screen right now.
Okay.
Um, so I'd love to see this in more detail.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm trying my Control Plus.
I don't know,
What
maybe
the?
that doesn't do it on a Windows machine. But something if we can zoom in a little bit.
Yeah, hold on. So I'll try it on this web browser here. Wait, hold on. I may not have the port right. Let's see. What port's it listening on? Yeah, it's a different one. 6853. Yeah, so I've also got it, showing up on this there. So this one, I think, Jason, I
There we
can,
go. Yeah,
yeah.
keep going.
Keep going.
Nice. There you go. All right. I'm seeing
Big
it
enough?
great. Appreciate it.
Okay. So we've got these four different scenarios that we've built as of now. There's the potentially we could do more. So the first two are sort of a function of been the historic rate of growth of regulatory restrictions in each industry. And then, but it sets the targets immediately um, versus the second two aren't a function of the historic rate, but they set targets where you can sort of delay how long this takes to implement. Um, if you want to see something like sort of slower or perhaps more realistic transition. Um, right. So the first one is a it's just a factor reduction. So you take the growth rate and you multiply it by x. So here on this slider, one, if x is one, that means just maintain the historic growth rate. If it's 5.5, it would mean cut it in half. All the way down to zero would mean a regulatory freeze. So no growth in regulations at all. This second one here is a scheme that has been suggested. It's like, okay, for every new regulation that comes in, X number of regulations have to go out. So the status quo on that would be an X of zero, which is right now, if you want to pass a new regulation, you can, and you don't have to retire or sunset any. Um, so this would, if I set it to zero, it would continue at the historic rate, right? So that's like your closer to your factual, right? So the counterfactual would be this would be a regulatory freeze, one in, one out. And this would be two out for every new one in. So this would be designed to decrease the stock of regulations. And three would be to just more aggressively decrease the stock. And it's very clear and well um, um, marked in my code, sort of where these limits are so that you could play with them. And, it's the beauty of open source, right? You can change that stuff and just run it locally for yourself. Um, and so then for this one, it's an X% reduction in the stock of regulatory restriction over Y years. So I've got this set out to 10 years. 10's kind of arbitrary, but I mean, it is what CBO uses um, for its budgetary analyses, right? And then again, here the X% reduction is set to 0. So that's, as close to a status quo as I've got. Um, and yeah, there's also then the all regulatory restrictions get retired in Y years, except for some X% of them that get renewed. So really the resulting growth rates and regulations that you get from these last two are very closely related. Like the functions look similar, but they're in terms of what policymakers might use, there's from a sort of a different mindset, right? One is a default where everything sunsets automatically, and then we have to pick some that we actively are going to save and renew. And the other one is more of a, okay, we're determined to get rid of a certain amount um, within this time period. And so it's actively seeking some out to target to sunset. Um, so so right, I'm gonna move to this one because for me, at least, this scenario I think is the easiest to wrap your brain around. Um, so let's see if I set it, I'll set it at 0.5. So sort of having the growth rate of these regulatory constraints. Hit run simulation, and there we go. Um, so this is in black, the time path of the regulatory restrictions that you see in the data. And then that little bit in red is where I've got uh, the deviation that comes from what we're setting, right? So perhaps these aren't quite as um, dramatic as if I rerun this with regulatory freeze, then you see that all these are little red bits are horizontal. So the adding additional years will show up as a whole red line, right? That describes what future regulatory levels would be. Um, Now, if you want to get really dramatic, then you can do something like let's uh, let's get rid of all of them, which of course I should point out, like the model is fitted to data, and getting rid of all regulations in a year is not really something we've observed before, right? So the further you move away from the data, the more you become worried with the model fit, because you're doing out of sample forecasting that's far away from the data. But nonetheless, um, if I run this one, then all right, no need to be slow and shy, right? You see everything bottoming out in a year. Um, so so this is an input, right? Like I take these different scenarios, and in my code, you can see I've got equations that describe how I'm combining the x's and the y's in order to produce the time path of interest. Um, and so that, so in effect, there's this simplified user input, but then, I fill it into the actual input that the model needs. And then I can do um, predictions that are of the counterfactual, right? So the the big quantities that are working in the model are establishments per capita and real GDP per establishment. Remember, those are those two things that I'm running those regressions on. Those are the state variables of the model. And there's, of course, two of those two state variables for each industry. And so here I'm just showing the historic in black. I'm still working on finishing the red counterfactual, so no big surprises here uh, in terms of, oh my gosh, I knew it was going to be that big or that small, or whatever the case may be. So there are each of these state variables, and then the the product of these two state variables, which gives you real GDP per capita. Boy, it's really being shy today. I'm sorry for my computer being slow. Um, then in the last tab, I'll just sum over these things so that you can see it at a more aggregated level. Of course, this is not the entirety of the economy. So you have to think about how it scales to the rest of the economy. Would it be similar, or would the rest of the economy just sort of grow as it will, right? So it's it's a matter of the assumptions you make on the stuff that we don't have this good of data on. So I might show that as sort of lower and upper bounds. Again, trying to capture that there's some uncertainty here. But it allows you to do stuff like, oh, okay, if we think that regulatory budgets should be tightened so that we don't get quite so ridiculously large growth and restrictions. Sorry about that. Then, it gives you an opportunity to say, okay, for what seems like a reasonably well fit model, what kind of predictions does that make in terms of its impact on the economy? So I know there's a few minutes left, Jason, but I thought I'd open it up to questions at this point.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds great, Bentley. Yeah, thanks for this talk. Really interesting. I love that you got us kind of an overview and then into the weeds of this model, but then summarizing everything in this app is super neat. And I like your kind of user interface choices here of having these different scenarios, and then the sliders are appropriate, and then we can see the output. I do agree with you. Yeah, obviously adding some more years or shortening the pre 2020 period or whatever will make the kind of counterfactual futures pop a little more. But yeah, super interesting. I did have like one thing that struck me in just kind of going through your model though is there's kind of like a production function for regulation, right? So there, as it seemed, right, there's government employees creating these regulations. I'm wondering how important is that in the model? Like, could you just exogenously have these regulations imposed or not and get pretty much the same effect, or is there important like accounting for that resource that is like the production of regulation?
So the version of the model that we did for for red, so the 2020 paper didn't have um, the careful modeling of the regulatory process itself. Um, so there's a lot of detail on the regulatory process that's in the working paper that corresponds with this reg rem here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but part of why we wanted to look under the hood is number of employees and or size of budgets we actually have by agency, and we know um, you know authorizing legislation that's associated with regulations. Um, and so it was an opportunity. It's an opportunity we think to do some ground truthing, but also to address concerns about things like reverse causality that some folks may have. They're like, okay, you're, you know, in the parlance of the identification Nazis, you've got, these changes in regulation over time, and you're looking at those and looking at how the state of the economy seems to be changing. But how do we know that's a causal relationship rather than some correlation where uh, regulators decide to, I suppose in this case, it would be pile on industries that aren't doing as well. Um, if the correlation were a result of causation in the other direction. So that's part of it. I mean, part of it is just the political economy of it is fascinating, and the there's an argument to be made, like even if you can't do regulatory budgeting where you say you can only produce so many restrictions, you might still be able to have an effect on reducing the regulation by just reducing the agency's budget so that the amount of manpower that's involved in producing new regulations means, okay, we're going to have to pick our targets here, and sort of more carefully instead of a sort of a fire hose of we'll address everything that seems to crop up. We'll focus instead on the biggest issues and the low hanging fruit, that kind of thing. Um, so yeah, we're a bit of exploring that.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, yeah. I hadn't appreciated it on like the empirical side of kind of pinning down this process. I was thinking more kind of in the general equilibrium framework. Was that resource flow important? But yeah, that's interesting what you say about having perhaps better data on employees and budgets there. I guess I would just be worried about kind of, wanting to get more into the weeds. Like it's more like the lawyers that might be the relevant part of the budget here, whereas like other people who maybe help folks comply with the regulations or help issue permits more quickly, adding those folks could actually reduce the regulatory burden on businesses, right? And so, even if we saw for a given size of employment or budget for an agency, how they're allocating that, right? Whether it's to lawyers to write new regs, and even there, it could be productive, right? Because they can be refining them. Or if it's to people to help folks comply with the regulations, push things through more quickly, you'd get very different impacts, I imagine. So, um,
Yeah, one of the features we do have in that part of the model is we have sort of like this idea that and I guess this comes from my environmental economics background. There's this uh, byproducts, um, externalities, and it doesn't have to literally be pollution, but just something that is undesirable to policymakers. So it could be lack of worker safety or whatever, that these laws are being passed to address. But in the process of making regulations, the efficacy of the regulation itself is going to have a decay to it. So it's sort of
mhm.
like maybe that regulation was a lot more applicable when it was first passed 50 years ago. Not sure we still need to require fax machines, that sort of thing. Okay, maybe not
Right.
50, 30 years ago, maybe we. And so, yeah, we wanted there to be some notion that there are regulations that would be desirable to sunset because they're old. Um, so yeah, we wanted to include that wrinkle. I think there's a hand up from Will McBride.
Yeah. Well, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Um, Thanks a lot for this. This is awesome. As I mentioned earlier, if you're on, this is exactly the kind of thing I was I was wondering about, like, because in the context of this year's tax reform and as I'm sure you're aware, they're going to they're looking for ways to include in the dynamic scoring these kind of effects and these kind of effects from I would assume before I saw your your work just now, that they're pretty large, and looks like your work also indicates that they're pretty large, could be pretty large. But I guess I was wondering about your paper that you mentioned and the graph you initially started with from that paper, um, which what simulates a regulatory freeze beginning in 1980, right?
Yeah.
And it just strikes me that that's actually a pretty small effect, right? I mean, it's a very long run cumulative effect, that, well, we just take the first 10 years there, which again, thinking about it in the context of, the 10-year budget window that will be used in this year's legislation, that doesn't look like it's very large, right? I mean, what is it, where did you get this? I mean, what do you think about this pattern of, you know, it's really more of a, and I don't know how to read the sort of the up and down period there in like 2008, looks like,
Yeah,
2007.
that's the Great Recession shock.
Okay. But what do you, I
Um,
mean, would this be, is your sense that if this, this same kind of approach were implemented now, a regulatory freeze, would it have a similar kind of time pattern? Or
yeah,
what?
it's not clear to me that you want a 10-year horizon as being optimal. My guess is that's was picked as a result of how long legislators tend to hold their jobs. Um,
What, the 10-year window? I mean, this goes
yeah.
back, I think they it used to be 5 years in the 80s and the 90s, I think, and then they switched it to 10 years just to try to account for more of the long term. Um,
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is that because growth is compounding, a really small change in a growth rate over time, expands into a considerable window or gap, like you see here. Um, so yeah, I would be concerned because I wonder how much when legislators are going to discuss this stuff that they'll have that sort of long run view to it.
they
Um,
generally don't, I'm afraid to tell you. They don't they don't care. We at Tax Foundation forever have tried to point out that it does matter, but legislation is, they operate within the budget rules that they have, that they inherited, and that's the 10-year budget window and the point estimate, and that's like 95% of the ball game, unfortunately.
Part of me also
And
thinks that so with taxes, there's a difference between when you have a permanent tax change, or at least what expectations are that it will be a permanent change versus a temporary one. If we'll see an effect like that in regulations, like in the past, very few regulations were ever sunsetted. So there was some notion that, oh, these are probably going to be permanent. But we've since, like during the first Trump administration, we had, something of a regulatory freeze, but there was also some sense of, well, this isn't going to last that long. This is special to him in that time. And so you may not have had the same response from firms. They may be anticipating, okay, the regulations are still going to happen under the next guy. We just got a reprieve, a temporary reprieve until until they
Yep.
get passed. And so you may not see the same opening of floodgates sort of effect that we have estimated in our model from
Yep.
something like that. Yeah.
and I think if I may too, Will, your comments remind me of your comments at lunchtime, which was, about kind of cost of compliance. And I think like there's two sides to this. Like one is like what Bentley's showing here with changes in underlying economic growth, but there's also like important other like allocation effects, right? Like it is part of GDP to spend money on lawyers, for your firm who helped you comply with these things, right? So like getting rid of regulations won't just boost overall GDP, but will make that person do something else that might be more, might be productive. And that's, I think, like that reallocation and that reduction in compliance cost isn't measured here, and that would show up, in a substantial way immediately. I would guess. Um, that makes sense. Like firm profits will go up. Yes, the lawyers' compensation will go down, but presumably we're anticipating them being reemployed quickly in some other productive activity.
Yeah,
And so
more
on net, it's
immediately.
not
Yeah,
affecting. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, more immediately than this. What are we talking about here? A 30+ year period. Yeah, but still, you can also imagine that. I mean, in CBO's model, and we don't do this, but they have a large effect of, sort of a short run kind of Keynesian demand type effect of spending, for instance, spending changes. And you can imagine here there would also be very short run effects that are negative in that transition, right? I mean, people, all those accountants and everything, they're thrown out of work,
Mhm.
compliance officers, they're not immediately going to be employed productively, right? I mean, they're going to have to be unemployed, train for maybe years. Um, and that there's a cost in that, right?
Yeah, and it's not even that that's uniformly distributed across the country. It's like very much concentrated in the Washington area. So,
Yeah,
what's going to happen to the DC local economy over the next few years is going to be fascinating to see.
I think we're seeing it even now. I live in DC, and it's my neighbors are giving me some interesting data points that as well. Anyway, that's a separate conversation. The DC local economy is doing probably something a lot different than the national economy.
Right. Yeah. And I guess my point was just that there are these separate compliance costs that might be important to capture, although exactly how they play out in terms of, their interaction with, allocational efficiency in the economy or in, fluctuations in employment in certain sectors are TBD, but like there's a separate compliance cost issue in addition to these kind of growth effects of, uh,
Yeah, that's
deregulation.
right. That's right. I guess a separate question about the model you're using here, as I understand it, one component is modeling um, um, startups, right?
Yeah.
There, and what does the model say about the sort of recent, what I understand, surge in startup activity during the pandemic, and it's kind of persisted. Did your mod what's your does your model what's it have to say? I mean, in trying to forecast that, I'm sure that wasn't forecasted very accurately, right? But I mean, what does it
Oh
do
yeah,
for,
the pandemic's certainly a shock,
yeah,
model wise. But yeah, it's I'm guessing the surge in startups is a result of some shakeups that effectively lowered the cost of entry in some industries. Um, and so that,
maybe by raising the cost of alternative employment, right?
yeah, yeah, certainly as a result of the pandemic, we saw office space has gotten a lot cheaper. So it's easier to rent some office space, but it's also just that video calls like this are easy to do. So perhaps less flying that you need to do to sell your product. Um, yeah, I haven't given it enough thought. Um, but it's certainly an area of interest. So what happens in this model is that the a new entrant becomes almost immediately or does immediately become just of the same scale as all the incumbents. And the scale of the incumbents then is driving how big of a fixed cost you have to pay to start up. Right? So if there's relatively few incumbents, you have to be able to compete with those big boys. So there's a much bigger setup cost. But Pietro's worked on a version where there's sort of, and I think this is with Angus Chu, where there's sort of asymmetric distributions of firm size and effects. And so there's a non-trivial maturation process from startup to industry leader. Um, but even with all of that carefully working through that dynamics, this rough assumption of we'll treat all firms like they're the same size still seems to do a decent job with making aggregate predictions. So that so there are those dynamics at play if you start looking at firm level data like microdata. But for the aggregate predictions, that seems to, I don't know, I suppose somewhat wash out the distribution of firm size within an industry.